So far, we've talked a lot about what environment variables are and how they work with fibers, but we haven't looked at how Meteor actually uses these things itself. And it turns out that in the DDP package in the live data server area, Meteor uses two dynamic variables for method invocations. So when you make an RPC call to a Meteor method, there's going to be two dynamic variables available to you. And here you can see on line 645 that is where they're defined. And the first one is called the write fence, which is the way that Meteor is able to notify a bunch of listeners that a write has completed on the database. And you can learn more about the write fence in the DDP live data class. And the second value dynamic variable is going to be the current invocation. So that's going to be the actual invocation object for this method. So let's go over to a debugger and take a look at both of these values. I've created a simple Meteor application, and on the server I created a Meteor method called dynamic. And what we'll do is open up a client or a browser window and call this function, which should drop us into the server-side debugger. So in the second tab here, we'll go ahead and make sure we have the latest code and then say meteor.call dynamic. And that should drop us into Node Inspector, right into the method itself. Now what we want to do here is to inspect the different dynamic variables that we have available to us. And just by looking at the call stack over on the right, you can get a sense of where these were set. So if we step back into the call stack, you can see back in the source code that we were looking at a second ago where the dynamic variables are set. So here's the invocation being set. And then previous to that in the call stack, here's where the current write fence is being set. So once we get up to this point in the call stack, we should be able to access both of these dynamic variables. Let's start off by looking at the write fence. So I'll type DDP server, and these are underscored to indicate that they're still in development. But we'll take a look at the current write fence, and I'll call the get method on it to get that current value of that dynamic variable. And here's the object with all of its properties and methods, which you can find in the write fence file of DDP. Next, let's take a look at the current invocation object. So for that, we can say ddp.current invocation, and again, I'll call the get method and clean this up so that we can get a better view. Now this object is a little bit more interesting because it encases all of the information about this current RPC method call. It's also the value of the thisarg inside of the function. So inside of my Meteor method here, if we type this, what we're actually getting is this object here. And that's why we're able to say this.userid, and if there's a user logged in, this wouldn't be null, it would actually be the ID of the user. But there's a bunch of other interesting properties here as well, like the connection, where we can get the client address, or even the HTTP headers that were sent down originally with the HTTP request before we established this DDP connection. Then there's some private methods here, like setting a different user ID and whether or not this is a simulation method or not. So by making this method invocation a dynamic variable, or an environment variable, as it's called in the Meteor framework, this object is available to any of the methods that get called either here or even downstream. So for example, if inside this function we make another Meteor method call to another method on the server, then this variable is, the original method invocation is still available, and we can get it from all downstream methods. So we don't have to pass them along through the method parameters. And that's what makes dynamic variables so nice to use. There isn't currently a way, or a nice way at least, to plug in your own dynamic variables into Meteor method calls, but hopefully at some point in the future that functionality will come. But in the meantime, Meteor uses dynamic variables in two cases for RPC calls. One is to store the current invocation object, and the other one is for the current write fence.